Is Alex Eala getting too much hype? It's a fair question, until you look at the sold-out stadiums and the brands lining up behind her. Because right now, the numbers aren't just supporting the hype around this 21-year-old Filipina star, they're outpacing it. Every time a young athlete rises this fast, the same skepticism follows close behind. Is this real or is this manufactured? Is the attention proportional to the results, or has a good story simply gotten ahead of itself? For Alex Eala, that question has been circling all summer, and it's a reasonable one to ask. In the space of a few short weeks, she's gone from a promising Filipina talent with a loyal but modest following to a name mentioned in the same breath as world number 1 Aryna Sabalenka and Wimbledon champion Linda Noskova. That kind of trajectory naturally invites doubt. Here's what actually happened. Eala captured her first WTA Tour title at the Mubadala City DC Open in Washington, closing it out with a comeback win over Jessica Pegula in the final. From there, she carried that momentum into the National Bank Open in Toronto, reaching the round of 16 before falling to Belinda Bencic. Along the way, her ranking climbed to her career-high world number 20, and she arrived in Cincinnati carrying the highest seeding of her career at a WTA 1000 event, number 17. On paper, that's a strong season, not a historic one. Not by itself the kind of run that should have brands and tournament organizers reshaping their marketing around a single player. And yet, that's exactly what's been happening. Tournament previews have started naming her directly alongside the sport's biggest stars. Crowds in city after city have shown up in numbers organizers say they haven't seen in decades. The question worth asking isn't whether Eala is talented. Nobody's disputing that. The question is whether the hype has run ahead of what she's actually accomplished, or whether something else is going on entirely. Because here's the thing about hype that outpaces results. It usually collapses the moment real scrutiny gets applied to it. Sold-out crowds either keep showing up or they don't. Brands either keep investing or they quietly step back. Tournaments either keep building marketing campaigns around a player or they let the story fade. So far, none of that has happened with Alex Eala. If anything, the opposite is true. And that's exactly what makes this story worth examining honestly, rather than dismissing it as noise.
The turning point where promising player became genuine phenomenon wasn't a single moment. It was a pattern, repeating itself in city after city, until it became impossible to write off as coincidence. It started in Washington, where Eala's title run gave the story its first real spark. But the moment that actually triggered the broader hype conversation came in Toronto, at the National Bank Open. Tournament organizers went on record stating they hadn't experienced an opening Wednesday sellout like the one Eala's presence produced in 2 decades, not since the Serena Williams era. That's not a marketing department's talking point. That's an operational statement from people who track ticket sales for a living, comparing Eala's drawing power to one of the most transformative athletes the sport has ever seen. Then came validation from an unlikely source, her opponents. Coco Gauff, a former world number 1, a Grand Slam champion, someone who has played in front of massive crowds her entire career, spoke publicly after beating Eala in Dubai earlier this season about what it meant to see a stadium that full, noting that she'd mostly been playing in front of a crowd rooting for the other side. When a player of Gauff's stature acknowledges the scale of an opponent's following, unprompted, it moves the story out of local fanbase territory and into something the entire tour has started to notice. The brands followed the crowds, not the other way around. As ELS results climbed and her galleries grew louder, sponsorship and endorsement interest scaled right alongside it, a pattern that typically only accelerates for athletes whose commercial value is proving itself in real time, tournament after tournament, rather than resting on potential alone. By the time the Cincinnati Open published its own preview of the 2026 singles field, the trigger had already been pulled. Tournament organizers chose to single out Eala by name, alongside global superstars like Sabalenka, Roland Garros champion Mira Andreeva, and Brazilian prodigy João Fonseca, specifically citing the ardent, raucous fans who travel with her wherever she plays. That's not the language tournaments use for a player riding hype. That's the language they use for a player who has become a legitimate commercial and atmospheric asset to the event itself.
Once the pattern became public, the sellouts, the sponsor interest, the tournament previews naming her alongside established champions, the skepticism didn't disappear. If anything, it escalated, because now there was something concrete to argue about. Critics pointed to the obvious counterpoint. Eala doesn't yet have a Grand Slam title. She doesn't have a season like Sabalenka's, who entered Cincinnati having won a tour-leading 3 titles. Her ranking, while a career high, still sits outside the top 15. By the traditional metrics tennis has always used to measure a player's standing, majors won, ranking points, head-to-head records against the very best, Eala's resume remains a work in progress. So how, the argument goes, does a player still building that resume end up mentioned in marketing copy alongside players who've already won everything there is to win? The answer that escalated the debate further was uncomfortable for traditionalists, because tennis, like every major sport, doesn't run purely on rankings. It runs on attention. And attention is measurable in ways that go beyond the scoreboard. Ticket sales, broadcast numbers, social media engagement, merchandise moving off shelves in stadium concourses. By every one of those measures, Eala wasn't underperforming the hype. She was matching it, tournament after tournament, city after city, regardless of whether the local population gave her an obvious built-in advantage. That last point mattered most, and it's what turned casual observers into believers. In Toronto, you could argue the sellouts made sense. More than 272,000 Filipinos live in the metro area, a natural audience ready to show up. But when the same intensity followed her to Cincinnati, a city with a Filipino population numbering in the low thousands, the hometown crowd explanation stopped holding up. Something else was clearly driving it: her. Sponsors and tournament organizers, watching this play out in real time, made their calculations accordingly. Brands don't typically increase investment in a player whose crowd appeal is fading or manufactured. They pull back, quietly, before the trend becomes public. The fact that the opposite was happening, that interest kept climbing as the summer wore on, became, in itself, the strongest evidence against the too much hype argument. The market was speaking, and it was saying something very different from the skeptics.
Every story about outsized attention eventually has to answer for a harder question. Does the hype outlast the results, or does it start unraveling the moment the winds slow down? This is where the fallout gets genuinely interesting, because Eala's season hasn't been without cracks. Her run through Toronto ended with a round of 16 loss to Belinda Bencic, and reports at the time described her as looking visibly worn down. Understandable, given it was her 9th match in 13 days across 2 demanding tournaments. Even Eala herself acknowledged the toll, admitting after Toronto that she needed a short break just to get her mind off tennis before heading into Cincinnati. That kind of honesty from a 21-year-old carrying this much attention is notable, and it opened the door for the exact criticism the too much hype argument depends on. What happens to the sponsorships, the sellouts, and the marketing campaigns the moment results start slipping under the weight of an unforgiving schedule? It's a fair concern, and it's one worth taking seriously rather than dismissing. Fatigue is real. Schedules built around chasing momentum can backfire. If Eala's results dip meaningfully in the coming months, some of the current enthusiasm will inevitably be re-examined, and critics who called the attention premature will feel vindicated. But here's what the fallout has actually shown so far, rather than what it might show eventually. Even in the tournament immediately following her most visibly tired stretch of the season, the crowds didn't shrink. The Cincinnati Open didn't quietly walk back its decision to feature her in preview marketing. Sponsors didn't pull away. If the hype truly had gotten ahead of the substance, Cincinnati, arriving right on the heels of a loss and an admitted need for rest, was exactly the moment you'd expect the wheels to start coming off. Instead, the crowd noise, the brand interest, and the tournament's own promotional language stayed remarkably consistent. That doesn't mean the questions disappear. It means for now, the evidence keeps landing on one side of the argument more than the other, and it's not the side the skeptics expected.
So, where does that leave the actual question? Is Alex Eala getting too much hype? The honest answer requires separating two things that often get treated as the same: potential and performance. If the hype were built purely on potential, on what Eala might become someday, then yes, there would be a legitimate case that the attention has run ahead of the evidence. But that's not actually what's happening. The sellouts aren't hypothetical, they're documented, city after city, confirmed by organizers who have no incentive to exaggerate ticket sales they can measure precisely. The endorsement interest isn't speculative. It's tracking directly alongside a season that has already produced a maiden WTA title and a career high ranking. The tournament marketing decisions aren't sentimental. They reflect genuine calculations about what draws paying fans through the gates, made by people whose job depends on getting those calculations right. What critics are really reacting to when they say the hype feels excessive is the speed of it, the fact that Eala's commercial and cultural momentum has outpaced her purely competitive resume. She doesn't have a Grand Slam yet. She isn't a top 10 player yet. Those are true statements, but they measure the wrong thing if the question is about crowd appeal and brand value, rather than championship pedigree specifically. Plenty of players with far less commercial pull have won more titles. Plenty of players with deeper trophy cases have never filled a single stadium the way Eala has filled several, in cities with no obvious reason to show up for her in such numbers. The truth is that Eala represents a rare case where the attention and the substance are growing together, in real time, rather than one racing ahead of the other. That doesn't guarantee it continues. Sports are unpredictable, and a prolonged slump could absolutely cool some of this enthusiasm. But right now, today, with the evidence actually in front of us, sold-out stadiums, sustained sponsor interest, and tournament organizers willing to bet their own marketing on her name, the numbers aren't contradicting the hype. They're the reason it exists in the first place.
But skepticism, to be worth anything, has to be willing to update when the evidence keeps pointing the same direction. And so far, every test this hype has faced, a tiring schedule, an unforgiving draw, a city without a built-in fan base, hasn't broken the pattern. It's reinforced it. Maybe that's the real story here. Not whether Alex Eala is overhyped, but how rarely we get to watch a player's commercial rise and competitive rise climb the same staircase at the same pace, in front of us, in real time. So here's the question worth sitting with. If the brands, the crowds, and the numbers all say this is real, what would it actually take to convince the skeptics? Let us know your take in the comments. And if you want to keep following Alex Eala's rise as it happens, make sure you're subscribed, because this is a story still being written.